An item that's important to me is this Christmas card sent by my grandfather from the front line in 1944. Christmas and New Year always were an interesting time for Grandad.
My grandfather was born on Christmas Eve 1924, and the Christmas period would always be an interesting time for Grandad. He first joined the Home Guard and was then called up to the RAF around Christmas 1942. Christmas was always an interesting time for Grandad. He was tall, well-spoken, a brilliant raconteur, great sense of humour, and his voice and accent were a cross between John Le Mesurier and Ian McKellen. Grandad was very calm and laid back. I only ever heard him swear once in the 20 or so years that I knew him. To that end, he became a radio operator and spent much of the war in a small radio van on various airfields. Not a glamorous job, but a necessary one.
I can only remember a few stories from his time in the RAF. The first was the day he was told a VIP was going to arrive and that he'd be put on the radio because he had the best voice. So this aircraft's coming in, he gave it permission to land, and just at that moment, 4 Mustangs buzzed across the airfield, and a Dakota landed, and Winston Churchill stepped out. Quite a big day for Grandad, I think. Another story was when he talked down a pilot who couldn't see. This was a Meteor Pilot, one of the first jet fighters, and something had covered his canopy. And now imagine flying one of the fastest things you've ever seen, and suddenly you can't see. I think it would be a bit like, you've just passed your test, you're driving down the motorway at, 70-ish, and some mud splashes up and you can't see where you're going. And your wipers don't work, so you can't clear it. Times that by 10, you've sort of got an idea of the predicament this guy was in. Anyway, Grandad, ever unflappable, managed to persuade him that he could see more than he thought he could, and talked him down. The pilot landed safely, and thanked my Grandad in person later that day. 2 weeks later, Grandad was promoted. I like to think that Grandad saved that pilot's life, and the pilot went on to have a family of his own. The third and final story happened a week after Grandad sent this Christmas card home. Christmas 1944, Grandad was in Melsbrook, in Belgium, as part of the 2nd Tactical Air Force. He'd just turned 20, and Germany was on the back foot in the war. On New Year's Day, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Baseplate, as they called it, which was the sort of last-ditch attempt to knock out Royal Air Force aircraft on the ground. Grandad recalled seeing a 109 appear at the start of a strafing run. He asked his flight sergeant if he should return fire with a Bren gun, because he'd recently been trained on the Bren. The flight sergeant said, "No, you'll just give your position away." At that moment, the 109's wings lit up. Machine gun and cannon shells exploding all around him. Grandad's running for cover. Royal Air Force aircraft are blowing up around them. The Christmas period always was an interesting time for Grandad.
Grandad survived the war and married my grandmother in 1949. They went on to have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Every year we'd celebrate his birthday at his house on Christmas Eve, and he'd be surrounded by family for the whole Christmas period. Christmas was always an interesting time for Grandad. On Christmas Day 2014, he had dinner with family, having celebrated his 90th birthday the day before. Sadly, he collapsed shortly afterwards and passed away peacefully on Boxing Day with my uncle holding his hand. Christmas was always an interesting time for Grandad.
I didn't find this card or the photos of him until after he died. It's important to me because it's a direct link to my grandfather and the single greatest event in human history, the Second World War. It also reminds me of the attack that he survived just a few days later, and how many men weren't so lucky. If Grandad hadn't been such a good runner and rugby player, I might not be here now. He made it through the war and lived another 70 years, having a long and happy life when so many others didn't. They didn't grow old, as those that were left did grow old.